Friends, I welcome you to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It is not difficult for you, but it is pleasant for me, and we're starting. My universe, my rules. Nothing new or revolutionary, just my take on a billionaire blockhead using his billions to be a jerk in a light story that I hope you enjoy. A story that I hope you find funny for St. Patrick, but it's not even remotely realistic. A minor detail. The 20-centimeter male organ is the 99th percentile. It is not small and not widespread. Warning, it doesn't burn a cheating wife too much. There are no volunteers here. A few minutes before midnight, Brittany Danner was in Dublin, Ireland at the Celtic Harp pub in the tourist areas, about half a mile from the Guinness factory. She was on a field trip with other women from her band Rockin' 50s. At 51, she was attractive enough to date from time to time, but most men her age wanted to date younger women for something serious. Brittany sighed and remembered her life. When she was younger and right after the divorce, men wanted to date for fun, and the queue of willing bedmates was long, especially after the story of her infidelity came out. It took several years to calm the gossip that she had changed. The time spent with her lover seemed to be worth it, but it quickly lost its luster. As the memories and thrills faded quickly, the guilt grew. Her ex-husband Michael told close friends and family about her infidelity, but he quickly got tired of throwing mud at her. It was a real insincere comment when he told her, "You're not worth the effort to tell anyone else about it." She lost friends and even ran into her parents, who were unhappy with her bad behavior. Not only was Michael done with her, she wasn't even worth throwing away. Ouch. Thanks to news from mutual acquaintances, she found out that her ex-husband had several relationships that quickly fell apart. When this happened, Brittany felt vindicated for her behavior. Helicopter flight, yacht, shopping in Cannes. Well, that's fine. A decent but immature lovemaking on a private jet, joining a mile-high club, was still an item on the wish list, safely ticked off. Everything was great until it happened, when her life collapsed after it all came out. Now she felt embarrassed that she had mistreated her ex to the point where he didn't have enough trust left even for a woman who had never offended him. Years later, it hurt the most. She tried in vain to start a new relationship with him, and when that failed, she tried to set him up with some of the women she knew, all in a vain attempt to assuage the guilt that filled her days. He was broken and simply incapable of the intimate trust that a woman needs to be in a happy relationship with him. After Brittany gave up trying to resume a relationship with him, she thought that if she couldn't find happiness, then maybe Michael could. If he had found happiness, maybe she could at least look in the mirror and love the man she saw. She never let him know that a chance encounter with a woman was anything more than an accident, as she knew that he would never accept her help in finding a replacement. After several dates, each of the women she quietly encouraged said the same thing. He's very sweet, but there's a cold darkness behind his smile. The fog in Dublin had dropped slightly over the city, and she was the last of her group to leave the pub. She sat and pondered, wanting to fix what she had done, with a sad expression hiding behind her fake smile. The bartender came up to her and said, "Last call. We close in 25 minutes. Brittany nodded with a fake smile. The bartender read her expression with concern and asked, "What's the matter?" Brittany looked at the bartender's name tag, which read, Patrick, and half laughed. The perfect Irish name is Patrick. Nothing, except that I betrayed someone and in the process assured them that we would both die alone and unloved. Brittany looked at Patrick. He would have been 30 years old if he had been in the daytime. Or was he 50? It was hard to tell. His eyes were older than his face. He was wearing a plain brown suede vest over a plain white-collared shirt. His hair was perfect and Irish red. Patrick was skeptical. "What do you mean?" he said in his Dublin accent. Brittany said, "Just this. I've offended someone and ruined both of our lives, and now we're both doomed to live alone until it's time to meet our Creator." She paused and sighed. "I am afraid that I will not be able to cope with this task on Judgment Day, when I will have to account for myself. I'm really alone." Patrick looked her up and down. "You obviously have friends. I saw you and them here earlier before they went to their hotel rooms. Your group seems to like you." Brittany said, "I have friends in our group of single women, but most likely I will never have a loving man again. I had the love of my life. I cheated on him and humiliated him, and everyone found out about it. I had a man who adored me, and I caused him unspeakable pain because of the thrills and adventures with a suave rich man. After he hurt him, he just fired me, and I have to give him credit. He didn't lift a finger to wage a war that he could never win against a man worth billions. Patrick said, "Regret is the most precious thing that can be." I know 3 things. First of all, I'm the best bartender, and that makes me a better listener. Secondly, you are the best tip left over since the last time you were in the pub. Third, you're the last one here, so we have time to listen to your story. Brittany laughed, and Patrick looked relaxed. Brittany smiled and said, "I think I could tell you about it. Maybe you'll see a situation like mine and stop it before it happens. You know, warn the woman about what happens when she goes outside." Patrick arched an eyebrow. "Maybe if I see what you're talking about, I can warn someone about the impending disaster." "Well, go on," Brittany said. "Exactly 22 years ago, I was at a bachelorette party in a bar very similar to this one when Winslow Charleston, a hedge fund manager, walked into the bar a few tables away. Several of the women at the table knew who he was, and one even came up and spoke to him. While he was talking to my friend, I caught Winslow's eye." Patrick grimaced. "It looks like trouble." Brittany nodded. "Yes, big trouble. At first, everything started out quite restrained. I was at Shaggy Chap's, a local bar, with a group of friends from work. It was a Friday night bachelorette party. I had a few drinks, but I wasn't drunk, and that's no excuse." Brittany remembered and told her story. Friday, March 17th, 2023. Madison noticed him first. "Hey, isn't this Winslow Charleston, the manager of the Charleston Foundation? He's cute and worth billions. What is he doing here with us ordinary people?" One of the women in my group, Sarah, came over to his table to flirt and talk to him. She was a busty blonde who could often break the ice with men and often brought us drinks from them. Even though she was married, she liked the power that her pretty face, blonde hair, and big bust gave her over men. While Madison was talking to me, I was watching Sarah, who was talking to Winslow and making him smile. She bent down to get a good look at her ample cleavage. Sarah was proud of her bust and even flashed in front of men many times. He looked at our group, then looked at our table and finally saw me and smiled his billion-dollar smile. After a while, Winslow stood up and held my gaze as he approached. At first, it seemed like he was just going to join our table, but when he got closer, he headed straight for me. To be honest, I was completely shocked when the rich and very handsome Winslow came up to me and introduced himself. "Hello, I'm Winslow, and you are a very attractive woman. Can I buy you a drink?" I was just sitting there, stunned that this high-ranking man had noticed and was interested in me. I was in a daze when I nodded. I knew he was flirting a lot, but I brushed it off and believed I could handle it. Winslow was a charming man, willing to work his magic and take his time with me. That evening, he never mentioned making love, and only casually mentioned his wealth, telling about a trip to the south of France that he had made last summer. Brittany came back to the present and looked at Patrick. I knew what he was doing, but I told myself it was just harmless. He knew that I was married and even complimented my husband, saying that he was the happiest man in the world. He was an unsurpassed charmer, full of compliments, and knew how to use his looks and charisma to the fullest. She sighed. Deep down, I knew what he was doing and I let it go on. Nothing happened that night. After half an hour, he smiled and left. But not before he learned a lot about me, including where I work. More. Nothing, and he didn't even try to kiss. Brittany sighed and took a sip of her drink and then thought again. So a few days later, it was the last day of March on a Friday, and I usually indulge myself with fried nuggets and sweet tea for lunch. I walked out the door at work and literally bumped into Winslow. He feigned surprise. "Oh, I'm sorry." He paused and said, "Well, it's a coincidence." I knew it wasn't true, but I agreed anyway and smiled a knowing smile. "I bet not." He looked at me and said, "Guilty. Would you like to have lunch? Just lunch, I promise." Foolishly, I agreed, and we walked 3 blocks to Madrid, an elite place, and we had lunch. And it really was just lunch, except that I agreed to meet him next Wednesday for another lunch. I met him again for lunch the following Wednesday, and he again mentioned his trips to the Mediterranean last summer, and how pleasant they were with the places to see, the clubs and the nightlife. There he lived a high life among the rich and beautiful. Looking back, I realized that it was all a seduction, and I deliberately walked right into it. Brittany paused. He played slowly and confidently. He held my hand, but that was the end of it. Lunch took 90 minutes, so I was half an hour late to catch up. An extra half hour of work is not uncommon for me, and it went completely unnoticed by my husband. I had another lunch, and deep down I knew it was only a matter of time. I entered Winslow's number into my phone under the name Vinny. Deep down, I knew I'd change eventually, but I let it happen. It was too good to be desired by a rich and powerful charmer. Brittany returned to the present and sighed. Winslow was busy next week, but we had a lunch date on Friday, April 14th. Winslow took my hand, and when we left the restaurant, we kissed. Patrick brought her out of her memories. Oh. Brittany nodded. Oh, that's right. We set another lunch date for next Tuesday, and it was she who turned the corner completely. He directly invited me on a week-long trip to the Amalfi Coast in Italy on May 19th. I was sitting in shock and was stunned. I didn't make the decision consciously, but I probably did make the decision. It took me another week to gather my thoughts and decide on this, but I didn't know how to approach the problem of telling Michael about it. Winslow worked with me and told me that I deserved a one-time indiscretion and an opportunity of this magnitude. He told me that I should just say that it was a one-time thing, and I would come back and be a good girl from now on. He even said he would arrange a first-class trip to Tahiti if Michael agreed. Brittany returned to the present. Can you believe that I really believed that my husband would do this? How stupid was I? Patrick said, You really don't want me to answer that question, do you? Brittany shook her head and said, No. Brittany sighed. So the dinners went on, but at the end of each lunch date, they held hands and kissed. On the 12th of May, the Friday before I went on the trip, I finally got up the courage to tell Michael. Or rather, I want to spend the night with him and then make love, and I was going to tell him about it on Saturday morning. Patrick sighed and said, It's only getting worse, isn't it? Brittany sighed and nodded, and then cried a little. Brittany finally pulled herself together. So we were at our favorite restaurant. We've eaten there quite a few times because they have amazing desserts in addition to amazing steaks. Michael was smiling as we enjoyed our evening together. Everything fell apart that night because I told Winslow about my plans. Winslow appeared. The memory flashed through Brittany's mind as if it was happening again. Winslow held out his hand and introduced himself to Michael. Michael was careful, but mostly polite. That was until Winslow looked at me and asked, How did he take the news about our trip next Friday? Brittany sobbed. It took a full 5 minutes before she pulled herself together. Finally, Brittany shuddered. I saw love die. I literally saw it in his eyes. Winslow just stood there as if he owned the world. Michael looked at me, and a complete change was reflected on his face. He asked me how long I had been making love to him. Winslow assured him, We haven't been close yet. Next weekend I will take her to the Amalfi Coast in Italy for the first time. We'll be gone for a week, and I'll return her to you safe and sound next Sunday for 9 days. To compensate for this, I'm sponsoring a trip to Tahiti so that you can become closer after that. First class and all expenses paid, including an international first-class ticket. Brittany sighed. My husband stood up and said, Over my dead body. The equivalent is over my corpse. Everyone was looking at us, and Winslow said, I'll only borrow it for 9 days. Michael was rummaging through his pants for his car keys when he said, Goodbye, Brittany. Brittany sighed. Everyone knew that I was just a woman of easy virtue for a rich guy. When he got to the door, Michael said, Hit the road. I cannot stop you, and I will not wage a war in which I have no hope of winning. The asshole can pay for everything, including dinner and our divorce. I'm not hungry anymore. Brittany sighed. By the time I got home, he was gone. Later, I found out that he spent a week with his brother. Patrick looked at him and asked incredulously, And you still went with Winslow? Brittany nodded. Stupid, I know. Patrick asked, What was Winslow doing when your husband left? Brittany said, He was very comforting. It was all part of his ruse. He was a good man comforting me while my evil husband was the one who tried to control me and deprive me of the experience of a lifetime. He paid the bill at the restaurant and drove me home. He told me that I deserved this trip, and my husband would be fine as soon as he finished puffing out his cheeks. He reminded me that he would sponsor a trip to Tahiti to catch up. Patrick shook his head, trying to figure out how anyone could believe their own lies to such an extent. Brittany sighed. I lied to myself. I knew that I had killed Michael's heart, and I lied to myself and said that everything would be fine. I foolishly told myself that Winslow was right, and everything would go back to normal as soon as I returned and made peace with him. Brittany was a little upset when she said, I was going on a trip last week. Michael never came home and didn't call. Winslow kept reassuring me, and I kept lying to myself that everything was going to be okay. Patrick asked, So, How was the trip? Brittany sighed. Amazing. It all started with a helicopter ride, and Winslow tried damn hard not to distract me and never mentioned Michael. I joined a mile-high club. I didn't even think about the fact that this was my first time when it happened. I just let it happen. I've had $1,000 dinners at restaurants that catered to people on a budget like Winslow. I had sex in a hotel room for $10,000 a night. The truth is, that experience was all Winslow talked about. Brittany looked sour as she described what would have been an amazing experience for most people. I saw Positano, Salerno, and Cetera. I've seen the entire Amalfi Coast from a private yacht. I had a private dinner on the seaside patio prepared by a local chef who cooked chicken marsala, which was probably the best I've ever tasted. Brittany sighed. How is this for irony? All these things, all worthless memories that are bitterly regretted. Brittany sighed. These memories are gold that glitters like lead. They should be memories for a lifetime, and technically they were. They don't bring me happiness. Patrick nodded, and Brittany continued. So I returned home and wisely came by Uber, not with Winslow. I walked up to the house, and Michael's brother was sitting on the porch. Somehow he knew I was heading home. I was nervous as I approached. He looked at me with pure disgust, pulled an envelope out of a grocery bag, and said, "You have been served." He chuckled. Worthless scum. Patrick grimaced. It's harsh. Brittany chuckled. I deserved much worse. Patrick nodded. So you've had a lot of great lovemaking and a few memories to build on. Brittany broke down a bit again. His brother broke the fantasy. I opened the envelope to see the divorce papers, and suddenly the memories weren't so golden. Making love was adequate. Truth. The honest truth was that sleeping with Winslow was a plus. Just like my husband Michael, except that I loved him, and that's what made him special. Patrick asked, Do you rate your ex-husband a B+ in bed? Brittany shrugged her shoulders. As far as the ability to have an orgasm is concerned, it's true. I loved Michael, and that's what made making love special and turned him into a Class A, until I killed his love. Patrick was still in shock. B+? Brittany said, Why do men insist that they all have to be some kind of super stallions that excite us with one look? Even before I met my husband, I had one of those high-class guys who could look at me and make me wet. He was the starting quarterback at my college. His name was Chaz, and we were together for 3 months until I couldn't stand the sight of his narcissistic face. He was a narcissistic asshole with 20 centimeters and a shitty attitude that worked for the bed and nothing else. I also broke up with him because he didn't bring literally anything else. There is more to life than crushing orgasms. I chose Michael because he had a huge number of more important qualities: intelligence, compassion, drive, ambition, whether he would become a good father. He wasn't bad in bed. He was actually very good in bed, and our connection made it better. He had many wonderful qualities. Michael's qualities dwarfed Chaz's by miles. After saying the list of Michael's good qualities, Brittany broke down again. The qualities that I used against him. Patrick brought a glass of cold water, not another beer. Brittany pulled herself together. Sarah said that I was a damn fool, and bluntly said that she regretted talking to Winslow and trying to win him over to her side. In fact, she took advantage of this incident to stop going to girls' parties. Imagine that. She had a big fight with her husband over this, and they reconciled, since she never went out physically, not even kissed. He knew that she flaunted her advantages quite often, and she had no problem with it as long as no one touched her, and she never allowed it. They both agreed to spend more time with each other, and Friday night became their evening. They are still married and still go out almost every Friday night. I still work with her, and she has a happy life that I envy. Patrick nodded. So your mess had one positive result. Sarah realized how thin the ice she was standing on was. Brittany nodded. Yes, it's a lousy way to do it. Patrick nodded. But you've already helped one couple, and that's good. 2 people are living a happy life now because you showed her that her path is really dangerous. Brittany sighed. That's good, but I did it by accident. And because of my own betrayal of a man, I stood in front of a church full of people and swore it. I don't deserve praise. Patrick narrowed his eyes. I see it a little differently, but keep going. Brittany shrugged. Well, Madison cheered me on with Winslow, as did Lauren and Katie, who I also worked with. I'm sure you won't be shocked that all 3 of them eventually went up a notch and eventually cheated. Each of them earned a divorce in the process. I tried to warn them not to go my way. Patrick looked into her eyes. So you've been trying to warn other women off the path you've chosen again. Brittany nodded and sighed. For all the good things she's done? Patrick thought about it and said, but you did the right thing. It was even more their fault when you showed them what it cost you, and they went ahead and cheated anyway. Brittany sighed. It didn't work. I couldn't do it. 3 times. So Friday came and I arranged for a trip to Winslow's house myself, and what kind of house it was. It was huge, with a large circular drive and wings on both sides of a large central hall. Even when I arrived, he handed me a Visa gift card and told me to treat myself to it. I heard a helicopter, which seemed to be close, and then continued to approach. I looked out the window and saw the helicopter land. He smiled at me with his billion-dollar smile and said, "Our trip is here." We had a helicopter flight to the airport, where we boarded a private jet that took off just 5 minutes after we boarded the plane. An hour later, I was sitting naked on a towel full of Winslow semen, a full member of the Mile High Club. I joined him 2 more times on that flight. Patrick grimaced. Brittany sighed. I know. So we landed in Naples and took a limo to this luxury villa overlooking the sea, and then had dinner at this amazing restaurant with an equally amazing patio with an equally amazing view. Patrick asked, An Italian restaurant? Brittany shrugged her shoulders. Wouldn't an Italian restaurant in Italy just be a restaurant? Patrick chuckled. Tush. Brittany smiled slightly. So, on the first day, we went on a yacht cruise from one end to the other. I had a 5-star meal on deck for lunch at this amazing dinner at another elite location overlooking the sea for dinner. Patrick nodded. It feels like a lifetime of memories. Brittany shrugged her shoulders. Looking back, it's not so good. Patrick looked at her. And what happened next? Brittany shrugged her shoulders. The same thing. Memories that logically should be lifelong memories but are actually lifelong regrets. Patrick nodded. So you've returned to the warm welcome from your brother-in-law. Did Michael come home? Brittany shook her head. No, he refused to even talk to me. As I said, his brother's visit was a huge wake-up call. Anyway, I looked at the divorce papers. The offer was a bit one-sided, but my lawyer said they probably weren't so one-sided that I could fight them. I tried to talk to him to save the marriage, but his eyes, his dead eyes. Brittany was sobbing. I killed his happiness. Patrick looked at his watch. It's 2012, a 10-minute call. Do you want to have a drink for the last time? Brittany shook her head. No, I'll be fine. Patrick asked, So you've been fighting the divorce? Brittany nodded. For 2 weeks. I tried to lure him into counseling, but he struggled with it. In the end, I said I would sign if he would let me talk to him for 20 minutes without a break. He agreed with that. Patrick asked, I take it that it didn't go very well? Brittany shook her head. We met at my lawyer's office, and he listened to me, as agreed. I started with an apology and ended up with one of them, basically begging for another chance between those 2 apologies. In the end, he said with much less hostility, just sign them. At that moment, he was just broken and wanted to get it over with. Brittany almost couldn't stand it and said, He said, please, if you have any love for me, set me free. Brittany was clearly experiencing this moment, and the ghost in her eyes was palpable. It was 12:28 and 2 minutes before closing time, and she sobbed. Then I saw hopelessness, so I signed the papers. When signing the contract, he said the last thing he said to me. Thank you. She was sobbing. He thanked me for freeing him. Patrick sighed and said, Let me get you an Uber. Brittany flinched and then smiled faintly. Thank you. Patrick sighed. It's a sad story, but it's time for me to finish. Brittany sighed. Thanks for listening. You probably don't want to hear me chatter until the end of the story. Patrick smiled blissfully. And of course I do. How can I help someone if I don't know how this sad tale will end? I will definitely see this situation one day and warn her of the impending disaster. I know I can help someone, and I will do it. Brittany smiled a little brighter. Okay, we're leaving in 2 days. I'll be back tomorrow night. Maybe around the time the last person leaves. I'll finish, and maybe you can help someone not go down my terrible path. The next day, Brittany arrived at the Celtic Harp at 8:30 with her friends, who were slowly filtering out as midnight approached. The penultimate visitor left at 5 o'clock before midnight, and Patrick brought fresh ice water and said, So, please continue. You seem to regret your decision to go with Winslow. How did it go right after you signed the divorce papers? Brittany nodded. So I sat in the lawyer's office for a good 10 minutes after I signed the papers, realizing that I had killed my marriage. Michael didn't say anything, got up and left. I wasn't even worthy of saying goodbye. Brittany sighed. I guess I really wasn't. Patrick nodded sympathetically. I'm sure he was in a lot of pain. Brittany nodded. And I was the one who was hurting. Anyway, we both worked and had good jobs, so we didn't have alimony, so we didn't have a contract. I followed him and even tried to contact him several times. He completely ignored me. Patrick added, It may take some time to heal from something like this. Brittany shook her head. He never healed. Me too. He still carries the pain that I caused him. Patrick asked, What about your pain? Brittany shrugged her shoulders. I deserve my pain. I just wish I could heal Michael. Patrick nodded. So you've never been together, ever? Brittany shook her head. He was avoiding me. I can't blame him. So it wasn't long before I completely abandoned my relationship with Michael. I've been stalking him on social media. He got confused and never seemed to recover. It seemed like he just existed. I tried to help him on the sly. I even sent friends to try it out. If I hadn't been able to save our relationship, maybe I would have helped him find someone and maybe help him find happiness. Patrick sighed. I take it he hasn't found anyone. Brittany shook her head. No, he's still alive, but he's actually dead. His heart is dead. I saw him last year. There was only sadness in his eyes. Brittany sighed and thought, If only I hadn't. It was like I was reliving this nightmare. Brittany exclaimed softly. Brittany returned to the present and gathered her strength. Talking to Patrick was like experiencing the whole disaster. Patrick asked, What happened to Winslow? Brittany shrugged. No one knows. He just disappeared one day after a year or so. It was quite a big story locally. They could never pin it on anyone. He was seen with a woman who was the sister of one of the leaders of a local biker gang. Her husband found out about it and divorced her. Every time they tried to prove it, 100 gang members swore that he was somewhere else. Brittany clearly didn't like Winslow, and clearly only regretted hurting Michael. She sighed, sobbed, and shuddered, and then said, I ruined Michael. Brittany forced herself to stop crying, finished her beer, reached into her wallet and pulled out 100 euros. She said, Leave the change. Thank you for listening. And now you fully understand how deep and terrible regret can be. Maybe if you see a situation like this, you can stop another woman from making the mistake that I made. I would like to go back to the date burned into my memory, Friday, March 17th, 2023, with what I know now and fix the situation. Patrick asked, And you are now? Brittany replied, Yes, I've ruined 2 lives. I would like to return with my current wisdom and knowledge and not destroy Michael. Patrick suggested, And maybe help yourself. Brittany sighed, Even if I could fix it for Michael. At least I won't ruin him. Then I can at least look at myself in the mirror. Patrick smiled and then smiled even wider, now seeing Brittany's selfless desire, just not to hurt her ex, and said, Wishes must be fulfilled the way they are desired. I see a pure heart, and I remember. He looked Brittany straight into her eyes. Sometimes what you already have is really enough. Brittany felt the effect of the beer for a moment, and her vision blurred. Brittany felt the world move and the scene changed. Her friend Madison said, Hey, isn't this Winslow Charleston, the manager of the Charleston Foundation? He's cute and worth billions. What is he doing here? Brittany was disoriented. What? Where's Patrick? Madison looked at her in a puzzled way. Who is Patrick? One of the women in my group, Sarah, came over to his table to flirt and talk to him. Sarah was clearly flirting heavily with Winslow and trying to seduce him to meet her friends. Brittany heard a voice say, Interesting situation, isn't it? Maybe it's not a good situation right now. Brittany looked at the voice and saw Patrick with a smile. He furrowed his brows and nodded in Winslow's direction. Brittany looked at Winslow and then back at Patrick. Patrick was gone. Brittany shook her head and thought, What? How? While Sarah was talking, Winslow looked around the table, then looked at her and smiled. Winslow stood up and held her gaze. He stood up as if he wanted to join the whole group of women, but he was looking directly at her. Brittany panicked. Winslow was approaching her. He was walking this way and still looking at her. Brittany looked at her drink and an idea came to her. She picked it up and hit it with a volley. Brrr. It was almost like a giant burp in the movie Elf. Winslow stopped and looked at Brittany with disgust. He turned around and pretended to go to the bathroom. Madison looked at her. Winslow was heading straight for you. What the hell was that? Brittany didn't say anything, just smiled and thought, an excuse to call my husband and ask him to pick up his wife because she's drunk too much to drive, and when I get home, I'll wear him out in bed. Brittany smiled and took out her phone, iPhone 14. She had a strange thought. The iPhone 32 was much better than the iPhone 14. She was confused by the thought and then waved it away. She shrugged and took his picture. Michael, can you pick me up? I've had too much to drink. Friday, March 17th, 2045. Brittany was in Dublin with her husband Michael and 21-year-old son James. Michael left with his son, who went on a special evening tour of the Guinness factory on St. Patrick's Day so that father and son could get to know each other. Brittany entered the Celtic Harp and looked around. The bartender was a short, dark-haired man who looked to be about 30 years old. His badge said, Sean. She walked over to the bartender. Sean looked at her and shook his head. Patrick's not here. Brittany shook her head. Yes, there is. I talked to him 22 years ago. I mean today. Sean shook his head. You must have the wrong pub. Patrick is not here. What will you have? Brittany sighed. Have a Guinness. Brittany sat down in a corner and looking into the darkness of her beer, sighed and thought, I'd like to see him and thank him. She took a sip and smiled. Life was good. Was it a premonition? Was it a dream? She was sure that she had lived 2 lives. No, it can't be. The memories of seduction and the trip to Amalfi were faint, like memories in a dream. Brittany looked at her watch and paced. There was still an hour left before the tour before she would meet her family. Is this place occupied? Brittany looked up and Patrick smiled as usual, and there was a sparkle in his eyes. Patrick! Patrick sat down with a pint of Guinness and looked into her eyes, peering into her soul. Have you been a good girl? Brittany nodded happily. I was a very good girl. So it was you? Patrick leaned back in his chair and smiled. Was that me? What? There is a saying that you can't look at a gift horse. Brittany nodded. Okay, but thank you. I do not know how or why, but thank you. Patrick smiled. I remember someone wanting a second chance. I also remember you asking if I could help someone not to change her by warning her. Maybe I decided to help you. An interesting paradox, right? Patrick smiled. You know, magic is just a reflection of the heart, and the strengthening of what is in the heart. At that moment, Patrick's gaze penetrated her soul. I see a heart that is very in love with her husband. Is life wonderful? Brittany nodded enthusiastically again. Yes, in 2024 my son was born. Around the same time, Michael opened a small machine shop. We carry out customized work for the automotive industry. We're doing well, and we have a nice house. Life is wonderful. Patrick leaned back in his chair and smiled contentedly. Patrick laughed. That was some kind of burp you made when Winslow came up to you. Brittany laughed. I have an older brother, Tom. He could regurgitate the whole alphabet. Patrick laughed. I can do it too. I can do it in Gaelic too. Brittany laughed. I could only get to the letter T. My brother has been a bad influence on me. Patrick laughed. Are you sure? That burp seems to have helped old man Winslow get away. Brittany leaned back in her chair, grinned and sighed. Maybe. Brittany looked at him with eyes that were neither young nor old. Untimely. Brittany looked at him and asked, Are you? Patrick stopped her. Don't look at the gift horse. Brittany nodded. Brittany looked at Patrick and said, You. Patrick laughed and gave her a just shut up look. What? Brittany sighed. Okay, I'll stop, but thank you. The bartender Sean came over and asked Brittany if she wanted another Guinness. Brittany looked at Sean and smiled. Let me ask my friend, Sean asked. Brittany looked back at Patrick to ask him if he wanted another Guinness. Patrick left and his Guinness disappeared with him. Sean thought about it. Not just a tourist, a crazy tourist. Brittany did a double take, then grinned and said to Sean, No thanks, I need to keep a clear head. Sean rolled his eyes. Brittany happily leaned back in her chair. Life was really very good. Don't overdo it with the story. I hope you enjoyed the short light story with a happy ending.